As I thought, we would either get new Nubatama cards or we would get the order card for this set. What I didn't expect is that we would get both today.
Stand up! Vanguard!
Hey Cardfighters, welcome back to another Cardfight update, and today we have yet again another Tuesday live stream where they revealed all more information for the upcoming sets for Vanguard. And today was one of those off streams where there wasn't a lot to be revealed because the upcoming set VBT11 was almost completely spoiled. We had all the VRs, we had all the double Rs, all the triple Rs. The only things left were some random rares and maybe some commons and of course the order card of the set. And as I explained in yesterday's video, that there was a highly likely chance that we would see new Nubatama cards that probably would support the Dominate engine, and that is to some extent true, even though that might not be as obvious in the card skills themselves for the new rares for Nubatama. But on top of that, as I explained at the intro, we also got the new order card, which is interesting because on the surface it really screams a certain support card for a certain archetype or clan, but is actually more applicable to different strategies and different clans because there are some interesting interactions with the Vanguard rulings and how skills interact with each other. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the two new rare cards for Nubatama and see how they might actually work with the Dominate deck and just Nubatama in general. And the first one that we're going to look at is a new rare grade 2, which is Stealth Rogue of Bonds Yura. And this grade 2 has one ability, which is Auto on Rearguard Circle. When your grade 3 Vanguard is placed, cost Counterblast 1 and return all of your opponent's rearguards in the same column as this unit to his or her hand. Your opponent chooses cards from his or her hand equal to the number of cards returned and discard them. Now what's interesting about this ability is that most of the bounce effects on your opponent's side of the field to discard them work with on-place effects, like we've seen with all the Kuchikiro Kongo support in the very first set wave for Nubatama, but also in the spare support cards spread across the different sets for the Nubatama clan. Now, what this card does is basically flips it up its head, and instead of when this card is placed, it's when your Vanguard is placed onto the Vanguard circle, which is interesting as that means that this ability could be used multiple times for a single card throughout the game without needing to keep placing onto the board. So just on the surface level, this is a nice upgrade or a nice addition for the Kuchikiro Kongo deck, so just for budget players this could be an interesting addition. But in the way that this card works, it's actually really good Shiranui support because you could actually activate this card on the very first grade 3 turn, even though you might not have called this in your early game. Because the problem with this card in itself with the skill is that if you call this early game on the grade 2 turn, so you can set up for your grade 3 turn, if you went first, then your opponent isn't going to call anything in the column where this unit resides as to not give you any value. So your opponent can directly counterplay this effect and negate the whole upside to this card and just effectively turn it into 9k vanilla. Now, the Shiranui deck combats this in the fact that the Shiranui cards have a direct superior right engine during the main phase. So you basically can ride your Shiranui on turn 3, then call Yura to the rearguard column, and then activate Shiranui's ability to immediately superior right into Oboro, which is also a grade 3, and then you can activate this ability to then bounce stuff. And this then also synergizes with Oboro as you then force your opponent to discard cards, and that way you can basically get cards into the drop zone to then get better targets to bind for your Dominate effect. So interesting enough, this card has two applications. You have the generic side of it that is just another way to force your opponent to bounce and discard cards. This can synergize with Kuchikiro Kongo, maybe even Jamio Kongo to some extent, depending on how your playstyle is. And it could be an extension of Kokoshi Garas, because if your opponent has multiple cards onto the board, you actually want to put their field to only one card or as close to that number as possible so that your Kokoshi Garas gets the most bang for its buck, that you can minus your opponent potentially to -4, -5, depending on how many cards they have onto the field. But it also synergizes really nicely with Oboro and Shiranui in general, because it synergizes with that superior right engine and maybe get better Dominate targets. And this also signals a new paradigm shift within Nubatama, because previously all these bounce and discard cards weren't really of the best value, because your opponent could just decide, okay, I get these units back onto my hand, I just discard cards that I don't need, and I can then replace those on place effects and get more value out of those cards. And effectively these bounce discard effects are somewhat of a different retire effect that we see with Kagero, but you don't actually get direct value, and your opponent decides what that value actually is going to be. Now, with the new Dominate engine around it, then suddenly this bounce discard strategy has another purpose, because now them filling a drop zone actually could give the Nubatama player more fuel for their plays, as that means there are more multiple targets in the drop zone for you to dominate and get better effects off. So suddenly this bounce discard strategy has a different meaning, because in the previous sense it was just to either clear your opponent's board, or if you played the Kuchikiro Kongo deck, it was to set up this guard restrict with Kuchikiro Kongo to then go ham and put your opponent in a unguardable situation where they just outright die to your attacks. So on surface, not the most impactful card, but there are definitely some interesting things that come into play when you look at the skill, and also then translate to the clan as a whole with this new Dominate mechanic that shines a light on this potential new strategy or playstyle with these bounce cards, which Nubatama already had access to for previous sets. So something you definitely shouldn't overlook. Now, another card which isn't something new for Nubatama is a grade 3 finisher card, and in this case they got another grade 3 finisher card, which is a rare grade 3 with the protect marker, which is Stealth Rogue of Incantation Hayoe. And Hayoe has a single ability, which is Auto and Vanguard the Rigid Circle. When it attacks, if you have 2 or more grade 3 cards in your soul, cost counter +1 and discard 2 cards from your hand, and until the end of the battle, this unit gets power +15k, critical +1, and your opponent cannot call sentinels to the guardian circles from hand. So this has elements of other finishers. It's similar to the cost of Kokushigiras, because Kokushigiras need to discard 2 protect markers or 2 sentinels. This just need to discard 2 cards in general, and it has a counter blast on top of that, and Kokushigiras has the soul blast free on top of that. So in cost wise, this is definitely cheaper and better to pay than Kokushigiras, because the soul might be an issue, and also the discard 2 anything card is much better than being forced to discard 2 sentinels. Of course, with the superior right engine of Shiranui, this isn't really a problem, because you generate 2 protect markers in a single turn. That said, because of that superior right engine, the condition to having 2 or more grade 3 cards in your soul isn't also the biggest issue, because this can be done on your very first grade 3 turn if you can fulfill the superior right engine and you have another Shiranui in your hand, so you can then shove it mid-battle into the soul. That said, that means you need to have 3 different grade 3s, because you also need to have this grade 3 in your opening hand or in your early game hand. So that might not be as consistent, but it's something that you should think about, because if you are going to compare this thing to, let's say for example, Kokushigiras, it's in the same ballpark with the amount of cards that you need. Now, it also is similar to a double or of the previous support wave, which is Fuzen Kongo, which had the effect that you could bind your entire drop zone, get 5k power for each card that you just bind from your own drop zone, and it also had the Sentinel Guard Restrict on top of that. So it could achieve the same amount of power or pressure to some extent, because this does have a critical, the Fuzen Kongo doesn't. But the difference here is that Fuzen Kongo has a very small window of opportunity, because you need it to be on 5 damage, and you also need to Soul Blast a grade 3. So that means that Fuzen Kongo in itself is a lot more restrictive to actually use, because your opponent can just put you on 4 damage and keep you there if they know you have access to that card, or you might not really want to Soul Blast that grade 3, because in a Shiranui deck, you're going to Soul Blast the Shiranui, and that's not really what you want to do because of Ouroboros skill, as you want to keep those Shiranuis in your soul, so you get those drive checks onto your unit that is a dominated unit. So there is something to say for this particular grade 3 as a finisher, because it can be a very fast finisher, it can be aggressive, but it needs setup and definitely has its issues, because it's a 27k attack. It does come with a critical, and it does have the Sentinel Guard Restrict, but how good is that going to be? If you can synergize this with your dominated unit that could potentially swing with a twin drive. Then you have your Ouroboros that also swings with a twin drive, which could have also a high power threshold. Can potentially put out a lot of offensive. But the question is this going to be consistent enough? And is it good enough to put out the Kokushi Gross play? Because that's a deck that is been thought of that you could combine it with Kokushi Gross. Is this better than that? Is this more consistent than that, or does it just give you more overall value? That's something that I'm not 100% sure of. It's an interesting take on the grade 3 finishers that Nubatama has, because currently they have a lot of strong rearguard grade 3s that could swing for game. But is this going to be a significant one? I'm not so sure about it, but it's definitely a playable card for Shiranui nonetheless. Now, the final card I want to talk about is the brand new order card, and this is an interesting order card because it's the very first grade 2 order card outside of the trial deck order cards from the Chronojet, Altmal, and Arsha trial decks, which were the first order cards that we got access to, as we've got this rare grade 2 order card, Illusory Spirit Manuscript Encyclopedia, and its ability is cost, Counter Blast 1 and Soul Blast 1. One of your rear guards get power plus 5k until the end of turn, and at the end of the turn retire that unit and draw a card. So this is basically a big belly effect in a order card, because you just pump up a unit and at the end of the turn you need to retire it, but you get to draw a card, so you refund that particular card that you just retired. It's a pretty interesting take because it does synergize with Big Belly, as at the end of the turn that you retire that unit, you not only get to draw off this order card, but you also get to draw off Big Belly's effect because a unit just got retired. And the 5k power helps you get to that threshold of certain units, because with a 10k power buff on the grade 1s and grade 2s, that's 18k, 19k, so with the 5k, they become over the 20k threshold, and you can resend them with Big Belly. This is similar to the double R grade 2 that we discussed yesterday, the Parakeet, that could give itself 3k power, so it could be a 12k unit. This grade 2 order cards simulates that to some extent. The issue here, however, is that it costs you a Counter Blast and a Soul Blast and a discard, because you're going to discard the order card itself, to achieve this. So unless your deck can either pay up for the cost, and Counter Blast Soul Blast isn't the worst cost here because you get the draw off and you get the 5k power buff, which isn't good enough for the value on the cost itself. But if the deck can manipulate this or get more value out of those out of this effect, then it somewhat can justify it, like the Big Belly engine for example, because they get a free draw on top of this, and they could potentially get a multi-attack out of the skill itself. So if you activate this order card in the Big Belly deck, this could potentially be you get a 5k power buff on a unit, you get 2 extra draws, and you get 1 extra attack out of this Counter Blast Soul Blast. If you add it together, then you could say that's worth it for maybe running this card if you do not have other grade 2s or other cards that can substitute for this effect in a better way, like the Parakeet, for example. Now, with that said, there are some other applications for this card, because this card in particular states that the power 5k is till the end of turn. So you could use this on a restender like Tidal Assault, Elgos, Show for Narukami, other cards that restand themselves. This could give you multiple value out of that 5k power. But another interesting thing here is, and this goes back to my Malum roots from the Jira, because this card puts a delay trigger on that unit, as you just give the 5k power to the unit, and at the end of the turn, you retire that unit, and then you draw a card. The important thing here is that it just states it retires it, comma, and draw a card. The unit doesn't have to be retired in order to get the draw. Meaning, if this unit disappears via some other way, somewhere down the line from activating this skill to the end, until the end phase, then you could actually still fulfill the draw off of this skill. A good example of this are cards like Battle Siren Nerissa, Coral Assault, Zuitin. All these cards that at the end of the battle or at the end of the turn puts themselves into the soul could synergize with this order card, because you can give them the 5k power, use their effects to then put them itself into the soul, and those effects usually then allows you to draw a card. Then at the end of the turn, this delay trigger activates, you retire the unit, but you cannot retire them anyway because it's not on the board anymore, but you still get to draw. So then suddenly, where this skill would say counter +1, soul +1, destroy a unit to get the draw, now it just states counter +1, soul +1, draw a card. This then also can translate with something with nitros, which just outright kills your stuff anyway, so giving this power pump on the unit and then the extra draw could potentially be useful. Then again, it's a counter blast soul blast for a nitros deck. Is that really what you want to do? Probably not, but these are the interactions that you should look at when looking at this order card to potentially get more value out of the card than just what's written on the card. Because the fact that this card generates a delayed trigger that just states retire unit and draw a card means you could potentially manipulate the effects and get more value out of the draw effect without actually losing a rearguard. And that basically concludes the last cards that were revealed for VBT11 Storm of the Blue Cavalry, and probably the last significant cards, as I believe there's only 1 or 2 commons left, and we're done for this set. And with that said, next week we're going to start getting into the VBT12 reveals, as next Tuesday livestream we're going to get the very first VR for Genesis, and that is the new Astral Poet Dragon. So we're going to start off with some astral plane mechanics or shenanigans, so who knows what that new Genesis support is going to look like. As always, this video has been brought to you by our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/Vanguard Insider. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/Vanguard Insider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one.